Fate. Souls and Singularities by Mundatorem Chapter 77-79. Chapter 77. Somber Return. The lights in the reshift chamber flashed as the coffins glowed. The lids hissed as they slowly opened up before Ritska stumbled out of his, soon followed by Mash. The master remained blank-faced as he stared down at the ground before he looked up towards the command room. Exhaling, the master reached up and rubbed his eyes with his hands before they lowered back to his side. His eyes swept across the reshift chamber, falling on each of the servants as they shambled around, with the exception of Boudica, who had returned to spirit form after Solomon departed, before they fell onto Ash. The saber was still covered head to toe in injuries before he looked up and noticed Ritska staring at him. Ash looked away briefly before he straightened himself out, slowly limping across the chamber as he stopped next to Ritska and stared down at him with a mildly troubled expression. "I will go to Romani," he replied, then moved again. Right now, Ritska had not the energy to try and convince the saber to move into spirit form and gave him a wave of the hand to spur him onwards. Ash nodded his head in response as he caught the tail end of the movement before he continued to limp towards the door. The metal exit opened up and he moved into the corridor while trailing droplets of blood in his wake. Ritska released a sigh as he looked around. "All right," he sighed out, reaching up and rubbing his brow once again. "I'm going to." He paused as he failed to finish the sentence, instead just turning away and walking towards the exit of the chamber. Mash frowned as he retreated before she wordlessly followed after him, the pair moving through the hallway in silence before the door started to close. Archer and Havel remained behind before the former turned to the latter. "And how did you find your master?" Havel remained silent for a few moments before he walked off. "Not bad," he grunted in response in a quiet tone of voice as he quickly exited the room as fast as he could. Archer remained behind before he exhaled, and shook his head in response. "Never an easy job," he muttered to himself before he too made to leave the reshift chamber. Romani watched as Olga silently departed the room, the woman having long since gone quiet since the arrival and departure of Solomon at the end of the Singularity. Romani similarly remained silent as he stood up from his chair. "Romani?" Da Vinci sent him a slightly worried expression. "Are you all right?" "MMH." The doctor turned to her in surprise, raising his left hand to rub the back of his neck before slowly nodding his head. "Why yeah, just a lot to take in is all," he admitted with a hollow chuckle. "King Solomon, not," he sighed, "not what I was expecting." The doctor turned away from Da Vinci and made his way towards the door. "I think I'll go to the infirmary. If you see Fujimaru-kun, could you send him that way? And Mash too. I'll need to give them both a check-up." "I'll do that." Da Vinci nodded her head at him, thinning her lips. "We'll hold the debrief at a later date." The director seemed pretty shaken up. "I don't blame her," Romani whispered under his breath as the door to the command room opened. The man quietly slipped out of the room and into the hallway before the door closed behind him. Da Vinci exhaled and turned back around to face the crew. "All right, everyone." She clapped her hands. "Let's get those readings on the Singularity finalized." She snapped her fingers. "Maxwell, confirm the status of Francis Drake." The prospect of illusionism was brought up. "I need to know if she's still alive." Her finger turned away. Jingle. Scanned to make sure the Singularity was restored back to history without issue. "What about me, boss?" Carrie asked, spinning in her chair to face Da Vinci. The woman stared back at her before she gave a sad smile. "Start the evaluation on the spirit origin of Solomon," she revealed. "Find out what you can." "Yeah." Carrie nodded her head, turning around in her chair. "You got it." The caster let out a light sigh as she rubbed under her eyes before she sat herself down in Romani's chair and turned herself to face the monitor. The woman remained silent as the command center quickly got to work. She wasn't under any illusions though, they were just trying to distract themselves from what Solomon had said. It certainly gave them a lot to consider in regards to the future of the Singularities. Either way, it was going to be a rough journey for them. The door to the medical ward had already been opened by the time Romani got to it. The doctor let out a light sigh as he built up what little confidence he could manage before he stepped into the room. It took him all of several seconds to spot Ash sat upon one of the beds. Romani grimaced at the sight, which was far from appealing, of the saber's wounds. "Hey, Ash." Greeting the saber as he stepped into the room and closing the door behind him. The blond man's eyes flickered towards him in acknowledgement before he nodded his head in kind. "Romani," he greeted as the strawberry-haired man moved across the room towards the saber before he started to examine him, taking note of the injuries to the body and the extent of the damage. It certainly looked painful, although he couldn't decide whether the eerie silence of the saber was comforting or not when faced with these sorts of wounds. The fact the left side of his body was burnt black and metal had been fused into his skin made him quickly decide that it was mildly uncomfortable. "Rough time down there." Romani continued on in an odd tone. Ash titled his head at the man slightly before he hummed in response. "It was difficult," he admitted. The arrival of the sorcerer at the end was unexpected. "To you and me both." The doctor gave a hollow chuckle. He called himself Solomon. He grimaced, which, if true, means that this is going to be a lot harder. "Is Solomon dangerous?" Romani paused, looking at the saber for a few moments before he replied. "He basically created the entire system of magecraft that we use." The man gestured around himself. "Everything in Chaldea is made possible by what he achieved. As for the demon gods," he sighed. King Solomon was said to have been the pinnacle of mages in regards to summoning, and the demon gods would be familiars to him. The man gestured to the wounds on Ash. "You saw what one did to you. Could you imagine fighting 72 at once?" "I see," Ash quietly replied, slowly nodding his head. He called it pointless. "Just trying to get in your head is all." Romani dismissed, giving the saber a calming smile which even he didn't quite believe. "It'll work out somehow, hopefully." The two fell into a silence before Romani moved and sat down into the bed opposite Ash, resting his hands on his knees. "Listen, Ash." The man started in a hesitant tone. "I need to ask you something." The saber stared at him in silence before he gestured for him to continue on. "Thanks," Romani swallowed. "When you infused the Holy Grail in yourself, I noticed something strange about the readings." He went on, "And I've been thinking about it for a while, and when I heard about your reluctance to go into spirit form." Ash stared at him, his eyes briefly glimmered with worry before they returned to their usual stoic dullness. "For a few moments, when you had the Grail, your spirit origin vanished entirely," Romani revealed, looking up and staring at the saber with a searching expression. "You didn't register as a servant for a few moments, you registered as a life form." "Really?" "Yeah." Romani nodded. "And I looked over some of the logs since then while you were in the Singularity. I couldn't do it for long because of—" he waved his hand, "what came next, but I got the gist of it. You haven't returned to spirit form once since you were summoned." "I have not," Ash affirmed with a nod of his head. "Ash," Romani rubbed his hands together. "How did you die?" Ash stared down at his hands for a few moments. The saber moved them to rest on both of his knees as he continued to avoid looking Romani in the eye before he gently exhaled. "I didn't." Romani's eyes widened. "You didn't?" he whispered out. "No." Ash shook his head. "I was summoned immediately after I had completed my task." He explained, "I have died many, many times, but I have never had a final death. That much I do know." "Ash, that means the Holy Grail wasn't burning through your spirit core." Romani's skin turned ashen. "It was burning through your soul." Ash nodded his head. "I know." "Ash," he hissed at him, then looked over his shoulder at the door to the medical center before looking back at the saber. "Ash, you could have—" he cut himself off, Then look down. You're a being that's been summoned into a servant container without actually being a servant. You're registered as one. He stared at the saber with wide eyes. Ash, you're still alive. The saber's lip twitched, a strange thing to say to an unkindled. You're making jokes. Romani gaped at him, his expression quickly shifting from shocked to mildly angered. Ash, if you hadn't removed the Grail when you did, it would have burned your soul into nothing. Without a spirit origin, we wouldn't have been able to summon you again. Ash. The saber stared at him with an unflinching gaze. You could have died. Permanently. Most likely. Romani stared at him flabbergasted at the casual dismissal of his condition before he steeled his expression, throwing himself off the bed and back onto his feet. I'm going to inform everyone. He turned away from the saber, barely making it a few feet before the unkindled grabbed his arm and stopped him. Romani turned to him in surprise as Ash stared up at him with a troubled expression. I do not believe you should. Ash replied, Romani's brows furrowed. What? Ritska has. Ash bit his lip. He seems to display a great deal of concern for me and of the servants in general. Even with the knowledge they can be summoned again, he is reluctant to allow them to perish. What does this have to do with? If he learns that my death would be permanent, Ash frowned. I am concerned that he would not be as willing to utilize me to the best of my abilities. His concern for my well-being would hinder my ability to function properly. Because he cares about you, Romani exclaimed, and because if that stunt you pulled in the Singularity has any bearing on you as a person, you have absolutely no sense of self-preservation. It was a risk. Ash agreed. But I weighed the cost of my life against the death of Ritska and decided it was worth the risk. Even if I had died against Heracles, it would have allowed them the ability to continue on in the Singularity. And that's all that matters. Romani pulled his arm free. Ash, you can't treat yourself like that. I do not see why not. Ash frowned. That is the purpose of Unkindled. We exist to fulfill our duty and die if necessary. Do you want to die? I want to fulfill my duty. Ash replied stone-faced. If that means I must die, then I have no complaints if it is not a meaningless death. That does not mean I have a desire to die. If I do so, then I cannot aid Ritska until the very end. And what about at the very end? Romani asked. What will you do when the Singularities have been restored and humanity is back? He gestured around. The servants are obviously going to be sent back. What does that mean for you? Ash remained silent for a few moments. My duty is to aid Ritska in undoing the incineration of humanity. What occurs after that is clear. He looked Romani in the eye. Without a duty left to me, I will begin to hollow. At which point I would soon cross into the point of being a danger to everyone else around me. Romani felt his blood run cold at the saber's words. Ash. The only option remaining would be to have me killed. Ash casually remarked. It would be easy enough. With no bonfires around, I would not be able to return to threaten you. Ash, you can't ask me to let that happen. Romani frowned at him. Aside from the ethical implications, I'm a doctor. Which is why I ask you to keep this secret. Ash's tone shifted slightly, the saber's eyes almost pleading. It would be better for those concerned if they remain ignorant to my present condition to avoid undue worries. You want me to keep this a secret? Romani surmised, pursing his lips and staring at the saber with a mildly distressed expression. The man raised his right hand to rub his brow. Ash, they'll find out eventually, and you're asking me to lie about something that could just as easily get you killed. It would not be a lie as much as simply not revealing the information. Ash tilted his head. I do not see how my situation differs from Mash. Romani pinched the bridge of his nose. Aside from the fact Mash isn't nearly as reckless, we all know about her situation. He explained slowly, Fujimaru-kun knows that even if she is a demi-servant, she's still alive and that he should ensure she isn't put in too great a risk. He paused and pointed at the saber. Not to say that automatically means he'll treat the other servants differently. He went all the way to Havel's room, a man who hates mages, and managed to convince him to give him a chance. Ash looked away. I cannot force you to do anything. I have made my personal feelings on the matter clear so as to avoid future issues. He winced as he stood up. If you believe it important to inform Ritska, then that is your choice to make. The doctor stared at him for a few moments before he let out a deep breath. The man turned around and cradled his head in his hands for a few moments. Ash watched him as he paced the length of the room for a few moments before he eventually stopped and raised his head to stare at the saber. Fine, he replied after a few moments, for now, I'll keep it a secret. But, Romani raised his hand, I can't say the same for anyone else who might find out. You can ask them but, he paused, Da Vinci would probably keep it a secret as well and she'll likely find out before long but that's a separate issue altogether. Understood. Just, Romani waved his hand, try to take better care of yourself, if that Grail had killed you, then nothing would have brought you back. Ash released a thoughtful hum in response, his eyes darting downwards for a few moments before he nodded his head. I see. Romani rubbed his brow at the casual tone the saber had before he turned back to the door as it opened up. Both he and Ash watched as Ritska and Mash walked in, the former paused as he caught sight of the pair. Da Vinci said to send us over here, Ritska remarked as he looked between the two of them, then back at Romani, how is he? Romani jolted, then looked at Ash and then back to Ritska. He's a little rough, but I'd say he'll recover in short order. He reassured him, a few of Sigward's healing spells and some natural rest will do wonders for him. Ritska let out a sigh of relief while Mash visibly deflated. That's good, so that issue with his spirit origin thing. That's all right now. Romani stared at him for a few moments before he slowly nodded his head. Yeah, he replied with an easy-going smile, I'd say it's all fine now. Just a little side effect of the Grail being used like that is all. He chuckled and looked over his shoulder. Ash is pretty durable but I'd recommend he be a little more careful in the future. I'll say. Ritska nodded his head. So, check up. Right. Romani nodded his head, gesturing to one of the spare beds. Have a seat, just need to make sure your vitals are all right. We rushed you out of the Singularity pretty fast so it's just that I can send a report to the director that you're all good. Ritska gave another nod as he moved over to one of the spare beds and sat himself down. Ash stared at him for a few moments before his eyes turned towards Romani. The doctor continued on with his work while sparing the saber a glance out of the corner of his eye before he turned back to Ritska. All right, we'll just go through this quickly, Romani commented as he approached the bed. The director will probably want to hold a meeting later. How is she? Mash asked. Romani clicked his pen several times as he bit his lower lip. He sighed, we're all a little in shock right now. We know who we're fighting but if it is Solomon then, he frowned. Just give the news time to settle though. He turned to Mash, giving her a tired smile, we'll pull together. Do you think he was right about the Singularities? Romani shrugged in response, I don't know, he might well be but if he is behind the incineration of humanity then it was inevitable we'd have to fight him either way. The doctor offered, all we need to do is just keep on moving. The door behind her closed as she entered her office. The woman sighed heavily before she moved around her desk towards the seat. Raising her hand, she moved her palm over the top of the chair before she spun it around and sat herself down in it. Go for a walk, Stall. Olga ordered the berserker in the corner of the room. The hulking metal golem turned its head to stare down at her for a few moments, seemingly unwilling to move from its location before the woman swiveled the chair to face the berserker. Now. Stall stared at her for a few moments more before the armor turned away from her. Its body creaked and groaned as the metal limbs shifted. The giant ducked low to avoid clipping its head on the doorframe before it stepped out into the hallway and did an about turn, marching down the corridors without much a sense of direction or purpose. Olga watched as the door closed behind them, then swiveled her chair back around to face the wall. "Why can't it go right?" she whispered out to herself as she stared at the wall. "Just, once. She hissed. "Just, why can't you give me this one victory? Why does it never work out for me? Every single time it's always something that happens and it's not my fault." She stared at the photo on the wall. "It's not my fault." She shouted at it. "I'm trying. It's just everyone else. We won. We beat the pillar and solved the singularity. We even beat Lev," she sniffled. "I did it. Me. I can really do it if I try." The picture stared back in silence. "How was I supposed to know it was King Solomon?" she huffed, thumping her hand into her armrest. "How was I supposed to know that Lev was a demon? It's not fair. Everything that happens is..." Olga reached up, wiping the tears from her eyes before they had the chance to slide down her cheeks. "It's not my fault. I really can do it, so please just..." Her eyes locked onto the photo, already turning puffy. "Please just give me a chance. I can do it. I really can." Her head fell down into her hands, no longer bothering to try and prevent the tears from rolling down her face as she quietly sobbed alone in her office. "It's not my fault. I did a good job. It's not my fault." A faint, and somewhat desperate, chuckle escaped her lips. People said I did a good job. They praised me. I can do it, just." She quietly turned away from the picture, staring at the desk in front of her with reddening wet cheeks. "I can do it," she affirmed to herself. "I can do it. I can do it." Da Vinci sat just aside from the head of the table. The seat remained empty in the conference room. The caster looked around the room, noticing the complete lack of anyone else in the room. Sighing, the woman swiveled her chair and turned to stare up at the clock. Raising her hand, she rested it on the table and slowly started to tap away. The woman drummed at the table for what felt like hours as the clock continued to tick away, the time dragging on until it was almost 9 in the morning. That wouldn't have bothered her so much if it were not for the fact that the meeting was scheduled to start at 8:30. She could understand if Romani was late, but for everyone else to be tardy, save her, was rather a big surprise. It was also rather frustrating for her, especially considering that she had prepared a presentation and a small speech to try and get everyone's spirits back up, even if they were understandably down at the time. The sound of the door at the end of the room opening up attracted her attention towards the entrance. The woman watched as Romani walked into the room, scratching the back of his head and looking away from her. "Sorry I'm late." He apologized as he entered. "Had a little trouble sleeping," he trailed off, his eyes sweeping across the room as he stared at the empty seats and then at Da Vinci. "Where's everyone else?" Da Vinci shrugged. "Sent them the memo but they haven't shown up yet." Her lips quirked into a faint smile. "It seems for once in your life you're actually earlier to a meeting than everyone else despite it being late." Romani let out a chuckle of amusement as he moved himself to take a seat at the opposite end of the table to the caster. "I suppose that's more everyone else being late rather than me, Leo," he excused with a slight wave of his hand. "I don't blame them though," he quietly went on. "Yesterday was a little rough." Da Vinci nodded her in a knowing fashion, giving the man a saddened look for a few moments. "I suppose it was a big surprise for everyone." "Yeah," Romani sniffed, spinning his chair to face the door. "Any idea where everyone else is?" She shook her head. "No idea where Fujimaru and Mash are." The woman's lips pursed. "As for the director, I haven't seen her since yesterday. A couple servants said they saw her berserker wandering the halls aimlessly, so I suppose she probably wanted to be alone." Romani slowly nodded his head. The door hissed open as Ritska and Mash strode in, the former having faint bags under his eyes from a clear lack of sleep. The master paused as he noticed both Da Vinci and Romani staring at him in concern. Waving his hand, he made his way over to one of the spare chairs and slumped himself down into it. Grabbing the rim of the table, he pulled himself closer before resting his arms on the surface and propping his head up. You all right, Fujimaru-kun? Romani called out with worry, you're looking a little tired there. Ritsuka made to reply only for a yawn to cut off whatever sentence he was going to say, the young man raising his hand to cover his mouth and leaning back, his eyes fluttering slightly as they tried to keep themselves open. Sorry. He got out. Not a lot of sleep last night. I tried to wake Senpai up but he looked exhausted. Mash offered as a way of an apology. I thought it would be good for him to get a little rest before the meeting but then I lost track of time. It's fine, Mash. Romani excused, giving the girl a reassuring smile. If anything, he looks like he could have done with a little more rest. Ritsuka released a tired chuckle, shaking his head and slumping back into his chair before closing his eyes. I'm just gonna. His head slowly shifted to the side before his body went loose. Da Vinci stared at him with a raised eyebrow and amused smiled as she understood what had happened. How long should we leave him like this? She asked, looking to Romani for an answer. The doctor let out a small chuckle as he stared at the sleeping master. Until the director gets here. He offered. Are you sure that's all right, doctor? Mash asked in a hushed whisper so as to not wake Ritsuka. What if the director sees him and gets mad again? I think she'll forgive this one instance. Romani remarked, waving his hand although he didn't look entirely convinced. Although I am wondering when she'll show up. He pondered aloud, frowning as he stared at the door. We can't really start until she arrives. A groan escaped her lips as consciousness returned to her. A numb soreness was present in her forehead as she felt herself resting against a hard surface. Olga exhaled as she quickly came to the conclusion that she had fallen asleep on her desk. Taking in a short and somewhat annoyed breath, she pushed herself up so that she could see the clock on her desk. The time of 9:06 a.m. was akin to a slap in the face. She'd known Da Vinci scheduled a meeting for 7:30 in the morning and she had completely missed it. A deeply annoyed growl emanated from her throat as she looked down at her outfit. Her uniform was crumpled and her hair was undoubtedly a mess from having slept with her head on her desk. For anyone to see the director of Chaldea like this would be nothing shy of a complete embarrassment for her. She paused, slowly turning her head towards the corner of her office. Ash was sat down, the left side of his face slightly red and at least looking presentable, in one of her waiting chairs with an entirely new set of armor on. This time he was wearing a thick leather set with an X-shaped bandolier across his chest with metal rivets around his waist. The collar was bright white fur extending down into a thick deep blue cape which he had draped around his body like a blanket. His leggings were still heavy metal boots with his arms hidden underneath the cape. You were awake then, Ash grunted, standing up from the seat, his cape draped over his shoulders and covering his front. That is good. She stared at him in silence. How long have you been there? She asked in a quiet voice, her eyes flashing themselves away from him for a few moments and down at her desk as she struggled to contain the mix between rage and embarrassment she felt. I do not know. Ash replied, after Sigward healed the worst of my injuries I ventured to the cafeteria to speak with Ritsuka. However, he had already returned to his bed and Da Vinci informed me that you had retreated to your office and failed to re-emerge. Oh really? Yes. Ash nodded his head. I entered your office to ensure your well-being and discovered you were already asleep on your desk. His eyes shifted to the object in question. Then why did you stay? She asked in a slightly sickly voice as she gave the saber a strained expression. Ash frowned for a few moments. Whenever the fire keep. Cecilia said she felt troubled. She told me that simply providing her with company was calming. He offered, I had hoped that remaining here with you would alleviate any concerns you might have. She sighed, so, What you're telling me is that you broke into my office and watched me sleep. Yes. Ash. Get out. Very well. Turning away from her, the saber walked towards her office door and stared at it for a few moments before it gradually started to rise up. One more thing, Olga called out, causing the saber to turn his head towards her and tilt it in an innocent fashion. Please don't enter my office and watch me sleep. At the very least, make sure I'm awake. Understood. He stepped out of the room and turned back to face her. How long shall I tell the others to wait before you arrive? Olga sighed. Give me 15 minutes. Also, don't tell them how you found me or what you were doing. She'd have to rush herself and wear one of her less intricate outfits. Then there was the matter of her hair to deal with. Ash turned away from her, marching down the hallway and towards the conference room where Da Vinci had told them to meet. He still didn't understand a lot about time yet, but he would imagine he was getting close. Boudica's going to be fine though. Romani continued on. She stopped by the infirmary with Sigward helping her. It'll take a couple days of rest, but by the end of it she'll be back to her old self. He chuckled, although she says she feels a little guilty about leaving the kitchen. Is she saying that, or are you just going to miss her meals? Da Vinci raised a suspicious eyebrow at the doctor. Romani pointedly remained silent for a few moments before he pointed at Da Vinci. Maybe. He admitted quietly, but they're so good though. Besides, you really like Sigward's coffee. He pointed out with a mildly victorious expression. That's because he decided to mix a rejuvenating spell into it. The woman dismissed. Everyone can agree that Sigward makes the best coffee. Right now it's who makes the best meals between him and Archer. I think Sigward-san and Archer-san both make very good meals. Mash offered with a small smile. It's very nice of Sigward-san to offer to help so much in the kitchen anyway. He just likes keeping busy, I think. Da Vinci replied with a chuckle. I'd say he's the better baker. She nodded her head. Archer is good at traditional means while Sigward is good at breakfast goods. You're addicted to those pancakes. Romani sighed, shaking his head. Sbagliata. Da Vinci beamed. I'm addicted to genius. The doctor let out a faint huff of amusement as he stared at the genius. Those are very nice pancakes though, he admitted, then his face contorted into a sad frown. I feel bad that he can't taste anything though. I wonder if there's something we can do for him. Da Vinci grimaced. That might be tricky. From what we can gather it's something ingrained into the spirit origin itself, she exhaled. As far as curses go it's probably one of the most powerful I've ever seen that can even afflict someone after they've died and become a servant. Ash-san said it affected nearly everyone. Mash mumbled under her breath before she looked around with a hopeful expression. But I'm sure we'll find a heroic spirit who might be able to help. Right. Romani stared at her for a few moments before he gave her a warm smile. Don't lose that optimism of yours, Mash. He leaned back in his chair. Seriously, don't. The door hissed open, attracting the attention of the three in the room who were awake. They watched as Ash strode into the room, briefly exchanging a glance with Romani, before they moved to one of the spare seats several down from Da Vinci and sat themselves down within it. Pulling themselves closer to the table before resting with both arms on the surface. The saber looked around the room in silence before his eyes fell onto Ritska. How long has he been asleep? A couple minutes. Da Vinci replied to him. So how come you were late? Ash remained silent for a few moments before he responded. I have yet to fully understand the passage of time being measured. You lost track of time then. Romani surmised. All right then, suppose we can keep track of the director. She said to give her 15 minutes. How do you know that? I passed her office on my way here. He replied without missing a beat, although the slow manner in which he spoke and the fact he was still staring at the table indicated that it wasn't entirely accurate. She told me to pass along the message. Da Vinci swiveled her chair towards the saber and leaned in slightly. Is that so? Piccola bugiarda. She looked him up and down. I like the new armor, by the way. I suppose your old set got a little ruined. I did. He nodded his head. I have already begun to use repair powder to try and fix some of the damages to it. Ash's brows furrowed. What were the other words you used? Nothing, the genius sang as she spun around in her chair before she exhaled. On an entirely unrelated note, how do you suppose she's doing right now? I am not good at understanding people, as recent events have shown. Ash remarked as he stared down at the desk. You get used to it. Romani chuckled, it's mainly women though. Da Vinci stopped spinning in her chair, slowly turning it around to face Romani while her expression was perfectly blank. Beg pardon. Wait a moment, that's not what Doctor. Mash stared at him with a hint of hurt, does that include me? Wait a second. Romani looked between the two of them, that's not, I. Olga arrived 12 minutes later only to find Ritska asleep in his chair, Romani looking like he'd been subjected to a vicious game of childhood nicknames and Da Vinci looking oddly satisfied with herself. Ash continued to just stare at the table in silence as she walked past him, moving towards the chair that sat at the very end of the conference table before sitting herself down in it. The woman's eyes turned to Ritska. Wake him up. Senpei. Mash rubbed his shoulders gently. Senpei. MMMMH. Ritska murmured as he turned in his sleep, blinking, Mash. He whispered out, reaching a hand up to rub his eyes. Sorry, just closed my eyes for a moment. He apologized as he sat up. What did I miss? Nothing. He froze at Olga's voice, slowly turning his chair around to face her. The woman stared at him in complete silence, seemingly examining him for any further signs of drowsiness. Fortunately for you. Now, Romani waved her down. It's been a rough couple of days. He explained away, and they just returned from a singularity. I'm sure it can be. I would agree. She curtly cut him off. Were it not for the fact we came face to face with our adversary. She took in a deep intake of breath. King Solomon, if he is to be believed, is responsible for the incineration of humanity. The king of mages and founder of magecraft itself had apparently decided we no longer deserve to live. So it seems. Da Vinci cupped her chin with a serious expression on her face. And it seems that he will be our final target once we deal with the singularities. Why yeah. Ritska rubbed his brow. We have to deal with him personally, that's what he said. That's what he said. Romani nodded his head, frowning. Restoring the 7 singularities apparently means nothing to him. The fact he didn't even attempt to kill you shows that he doesn't take us seriously in the least. Ritska remained silent for a few moments before he looked around the table. That's a good thing, right? He saw the brief expressions of confusion. Well, he said he won't interfere, and if he isn't taking us seriously then he might make a mistake. I'm going to excuse that comment on the fact that you are ill-informed as to quite how powerful Solomon is. Olga raised her hand. His dismissal of us is because we apparently don't even register as a threat to him, and with 72 of the demon gods, like the one we encountered in the 3rd singularity, at his disposal he does not need to intervene personally. We beat Furnius though, Ritska pointed out, only for Olga to give him a flat look. We beat one. After it killed one servant and crippled another and was attacked by a wayward phantasmal, then relied upon Francis Drake using the Grail to fuel the use of a noble phantasm. She let out a breath and slumped. 72 of them is. Well, let's focus on what we know for now. Da Vinci spoke up, flashing Mash and Ritska a faint smile. I got the report back from Maxwell. The 3rd singularity was restored. It seems whoever saved Francis Drake returned her back to her proper time and place. So we might have a little assistance from someone out there. Solomon said he didn't know about them, Ritska pointed out. That might also be because he made no effort to look into us. Olga muttered, then shook her head and turned to Da Vinci. What did you get from the readings of Furnius? The genius winced slightly, then pressed a small button and pointed towards the wall behind the director. The lights dimmed as a projector descended from the ceiling and flashed an image onto the wall. This number is the St. Graph reading of our resident Irish Lancer. Da Vinci pointed at the screen as a number flashed up. He's considered to be a B+ to a rank servant, so his power ranking sits at around 80. Is that high? Ritska looked around the room. Usually. Yes. Da Vinci nodded her head. In a traditional Grail war, this would be very high. Usual rankings go from E to A, with each increase representing an addition of 10 to the original value. If we get into the plus, then that's just doubling the value of the original number. Right. Ritska nodded his head. What's MASH? Senpei. She's around C+ to B at the moment. Da Vinci admitted. Ritska smiled and sent the shielder a thumbs up, earning a faint smile from the girl in response. Anyway, that's just the usual St. Graph readings. Da Vinci's expression tightened. This number represents the power ranking we discerned from Furnius. She pressed the button again. Ritska's expression faltered into a slight downwards expression. 2,500. His magical signature was higher than that of a Holy Grail. Da Vinci replied, moving on from that, Furnius' rank in the Book of Ars Goetia places him as a Marquis. Which is slap bang in the middle of pillar rankings. Then, he's average. Ritska looked down. He's average. Da Vinci nodded her head. Then there was Solomon. What did he register as? Da Vinci's expression faltered slightly, looking away for a few moments as she bit her lip. It's not that important. Da Vinci. Ritska stared at her. What did Solomon rank at? The caster stared at him, then wordlessly pressed the remote again. Is that a decimal point? No. Da Vinci shook her head. Solomon ranked at 20,000 on the St. Graph reading from what we could get from him. She quickly raised her hands. Don't worry too much about the numbers, Mie Amikai. She hastily added on. I'd only rank as a C rank servant, so I'm only at a value of 30, but I'm obviously worth much more than that. Right. Ritska shakily nodded his head. Just a big number is all, he admitted with shaky breath. He exhaled. So, singularities first then. Singularities first. Olga agreed. With Solomon refusing to act, we are afforded freedom through apathy. Our goal remained the correction of the singularities anyway. Romani nodded his head before he frowned. Solomon said all 7 of his singularities. He commented after a few moments, his brows furrowed in confusion. And, Olga gave him a raised eyebrow. There are 8 singularities. He replied, excluding singularity F. He added, so, does that mean that the 8th singularity isn't his? Olga frowned in thought, turning to Da Vinci, who sported a similar expression of puzzlement, perhaps a third party. It's possible. The caster slowly nodded her head, but a minute singularity was created when the goddess Artemis broke into Chaldea and stole all our food. It might be something like this. Someone stealing all our food. Ritska gave an incredulous expression, earning a roll of the eyes from Da Vinci. Not what I meant. I mean someone creating a singularity themselves outside of Solomon's designs. However, as the end result still distorts the natural flow of human history, he would have no reason to correct it, so it works out in his favor. Olga hummed in response, leaning back into her chair before she sighed. All right, for the time being, focus on finding the next singularity. She looked down. When it comes to Solomon, we can. She looked down at the desk, her lip quivering slightly. We can deal with it later. Romani quickly cut in. We've only just found out what we're dealing with. For the time being, we should prioritize the singularities. We can worry about Solomon as a secondary objective until we're ready to face him. He gave a faint smile. We'll probably get some other servants at some point. We can begin strategizing after we know more about the singularities. We did defeat a demon pillar god. So it's not impossible. Yeah. Ritska gave a nod of his head, his lip twitching upwards. We can do this. Nice attitude. Da Vinci snapped her finger while pointing at him. Positiva thinking is what we need right now. What language does she keep speaking in? Ash frowned at the caster before looking around. It doesn't make sense to me. Romani blinked. Why not? Then paused. By the way, is that grail still in your bottomless box? Yes. Ash nodded his head, then looked at Da Vinci. I assume you want it put with the others. For the time being, yes. Da Vinci nodded her head. Considering it's a grail from another world, it is certainly something worth looking into. Stop by my workshop later. She paused, then narrowed her eyes at him, and don't break anything this time. I wasn't intending on it. Ash replied with a small frown, looking down. All right then. Olga interrupted, jokes aside. This concludes our meeting. She looked at Romani. You start searching for the next singularity. Then turned to Ritska. You, get some rest. Same with you, Mash. Your performance has been adequate thus far and you are in need of sufficient rest before we resume teaching and summoning. All right. Ritska nodded his head, giving Olga a faint smile. Thanks, director. Olga hummed in response. Just prepare yourself and remember the notes I gave you. She then turned to Ash. And you? Ash tilted his head. Is there a problem? While Chaldea's generators are capable of supporting multiple servants and repeated summonings, that does not make our reserves infinite. Repeatedly summoning someone back after they stupidly threw away their life is not something that can be justified. She narrowed her eyes, refrain from such acts in the future. Ash looked down at the table again. He let out a small hum in response. All right everyone. Romani slid back. I heard Sigward was making cake. So I'm going to the cafeteria. Is it his chocolate or caramel? Olga asked. I don't know. Romani frowned. It might also be velvet. He was looking through some of Julia's cookbooks and thinking of branching out. I wanted to get some before the servants did. Olga wordlessly stood up from her chair and quickly paced over to the door. Romani watched her leave before his eyebrows raised themselves. Hey. He skirted around the table after her. I want some of that cake too. He called out as he raced for the door. You eat enough cake. You're a doctor, take better care of your body. Olga's voice echoed back through the hallway. Ritska, Mash, Ash and Da Vinci watched the duo sprint out of the room and disappear around the corner as fast as they could before they all looked back around. I wonder if Sigward is putting some of that magical stuff in his cake. Ritska muttered aloud as he stood up. Senpai. Mash frowned at him. You need rest. Having cake so early in the morning is bad for your health. Yeah. Ritska looked down, idly drawing circles on the table with his fingers. But what if it all gets eaten? He muttered aloud. Mash opened her mouth to reply before it slowly closed. We should probably get him to save us some. She allowed, standing up and following Ritska out of the room quietly. Da Vinci and Ash remained in the room by themselves, both staring at the now empty room before the saber slowly rose from his seat. I shall wait for such a time as I am needed. Not going for any cake? Da Vinci asked. Ash shook his head in response. It would be wasted on me. He commented as he walked towards the door. Da Vinci sighed at him, shaking her head at him as he left. She would have to thank Sigward for accepting her request for cooking the velvet cake. Considering how stressful the situation had been, it hadn't taken much to convince the saber to try and cook up some treats for the staff to try and take their minds off of everything. Suffice to say the saber had been all for it once she explained it to him. It might not be healthy, but she figured they could afford to indulge themselves. especially with everything that lay ahead of them. They'd probably need a few more rests like this. Little Aftermath chapter. A nice little Sigward and Da Vinci collaboration to make everyone sugary treats. Anyway, we're going on to By the Bonfire chapter after this. Oh yeah, Ash isn't dead. Surprised no one realized that. He never had a final death and was summoned moments after snuffing the flame. As for why he's weaker than you expected, there's a very good reason for that. His servant container is restricting him in the same way you summon servants as opposed to heroic spirits themselves. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. By the Bonfire, Distant Memories. For Gwyndolin to be seen outside of his room was a rare sight. Ever since he had arrived, his presence had been negligible. He had avoided contact with virtually everyone present in Chaldea, including Havel, and only ever emerged whenever it related to another god. The incident where he had spoken with Euryale had been the longest he had been seen in nearly a week. Suffice to say that of the servants that had been summoned, he was on the far end of being isolationist. Through entirely his own choice, Gwyndolin stared straight ahead of himself as his body slithered through the halls of Chaldea. He considered it fortunate that no one was present to see him. He very much enjoyed avoiding conversation with anyone he had no business with, and he had never been one for conversing with mortals anyway. Not even Havel was among those he wished to converse with, although that was for an entirely different reason altogether. He knew the bishop was aware of why it was best neither of them conversed. They hadn't been particularly close beforehand, and the incident had only soured whatever potential relationship they could have had. In truth, Gwyndolin had only allowed himself to be summoned to Chaldea in order to spite Sullivan and outlast him. He'd achieved that, and as for why he stayed, there was a chance he'd see some old acquaintances again. That would have been amicable. Not his family though, save Filianor and Gwyn. As for Yorshka, that would depend upon how she might be summoned. He approached the room to which he had been called to. He'd never directly conversed with this Da Vinci before, and he'd had no real interest to make the attempt before today. However, she had gone through the trouble of sending him a message to meet with him. At the very least, it would be poor form for him to decline the invitation. He would also impress upon her that it was the gods who summoned mortals and not the other way around. The god came to a halt in front of her door, staring at it before he made to press one of the small buttons to grant entry. The door opened up before he could. The smiling face of the caster on the other side greeted him. "Ah, there you are," she beamed, turning around and gesturing for him to enter. Come in, come in. I just need your assistance with something, probably won't take long at all." She wandered into her workshop. Gwyndolin stood by the door for a few moments before his delicate lips pulled into a faint frown. "Thou art most arrogant to believe that thee can so casually calleth upon the god of the dark moon as though I were." He spoke in an indignant tone of voice as he entered, planning on further berating her before his eyes caught sight of something sitting upon her table. The god's words died on his lips as his mouth remained slightly parted before it closed shut. "We picked this up in the last Singularity," Da Vinci explained as she moved around the table, resting both her hands on the wood and staring at the basin with a studious expression. "It's definitely divine in origin, but I've got very little experience in dealing with the works of gods. I can probably unravel it shortly enough, but I figured I could always consult a resident god and see if they had." "Beest silent for a moment," Gwyndolin whispered out to her. Da Vinci gave him a pout as he continued to stare at the golden basin. Shifting his body to face the table, he slowly moved over to it until he came to a halt around a foot from the object in question. His lips pulled themselves into a thin line while his helmet hid away the rest of his expression. His slender hands fell to his side and remained loose before he gradually lifted his left hand and reached towards it, his fingers halted a few millimeters from the bowl before they retracted. His hand pulled back into a fist and he returned it to his side as if scared to touch it. "Thee did acquire this in the previous venture?" he asked in a low, almost disbelieving, whisper. Da Vinci stared at him with a curious expression before she nodded her head in affirmation. "We did," she replied. "We got it from one of the servants, who said they got it from another servant." "I see," Gwyndolin murmured to himself. "And what did thee wanteth with it?" he asked, still staring down at the golden basin. "For starters, I'd like to see what we can do to use it," she replied, crossing her arms. "From what we know, it's similar enough to a Holy Grail in that isn't designed to store magical energy. Souls. Da Vinci turned to Gwyndolin as he whispered something out. She frowned and blinked. "What did you say?" "Souls," he repeated, turning his head to fix his attention up her. "T-wast did create to holdeth the souls of lords," he quietly revealed, looking back at it, "the Lord vessel. The lasteth work of Trahyarn before his death, and did present to those who iced wouldst link the fire." He looked down, until it was shattered. "Hold the souls of lords," Da Vinci hummed to herself. "It was made to hold the souls of gods then," she realized, staring down at the desk. "That is, probably much stronger than your average Holy Grail." Gwyndolin gave an empty huff. "It did grant the ability to moveth between bonfires instantly," he explained further before looking away from the Lord vessel. "This was granted to Princess Guinevere until she departed to far-off lands. Whereupon it was granted to me until I bestowed it upon another." Da Vinci stared at him. "So, this Trahyarn was the original owner. The god of smiths made it at the behest of Lord Gwyn." Gwyndolin curtly replied, "He is the owner. All others merely carried out his original will in regards to the purpose of the Lord vessel." HMPH. Da Vinci let out another hum. "So, teleportation you say?" She mused, staring at it. "I wonder," then looked at him. "How much would it bother you if we used this for Chaldea?" Gwyndolin stared at her, then back at the Lord vessel. "T-wast already broken once. Yond is shame now to disgrace the one who iced did hold it. Allowing Myrtles to use Seth it cannot shame such a being further." He turned away from her, waving his hand. "Do with it what you will." "Thanks." Da Vinci gave him a half smile. "We'll try and put it to good use." Gwyndolin remained silent as he exited the room, disappearing into the hallways and leaving Da Vinci to her own devices. The woman watched the door close behind the god before she turned her head back to the Lord vessel and allowed a smile to grace her features. This was already sounding like quite the find, and discovering that they would basically be granted free reign with it without concern was certainly welcome news. She had a plethora of ideas and unfortunately she was by herself, but she had no doubts she'd be able to come up with something spectacular. Gwyndolin silently stalked through the halls. Seeing the Lord vessel again had certainly dragged up some very, very old memories for him. Quite who was carrying it was a mystery to him, but it didn't matter either way. The Lord vessel was evidently made whole again through some unknown means. That had been the first black mark to his name. Allowing the Lord vessel to be shattered and robbing them of the certainty of linking the fire was something which had almost ruined him at the time. A failure he knew would haunt him. And yet it was back. All he really needed to do was keep it safe and away from the prying hands of mortals, and he could redeem his previous failure. As if that would have changed anything. The Lord vessel had still been broken. Whatever he did with this serendipitous arrival of the restored version did not wash away his previous disgrace. The duty he had picked up when Guinevere had abandoned their family and all they stood for was something he prided himself in. With no one left, he would continue Lord Gwyn's desire for as long as he could. And he'd failed. It was only by mere chance that the flame had been linked and that he had been able to restore the presence of the gods. Mere chance had saved them from his blunder. He knew in his heart that any one of the others would not have allowed the situation to transpire so far to begin with. That was the truth of the situation. He had failed everything. The Lord vessel had been shattered and it had disgraced him. Allowing mortals to use it for their own agenda would bring no further shame to him at this point. He was already an embarrassment enough to the royal family, he couldn't do any further damage. He paused in the hallway, his lips parting and releasing a somewhat shaky breath. Reaching his hand up, his fingers lightly touched upon his cheek before coming away. He stared down at the clear liquid on the tip of his finger with disgust. A prince does not cry. Lord Gwyn's words to his older brother still rung true in his head. A prince does not cry. He was a prince and he would not cry. Even though the words were not directed towards him, he still took them to heart. Breathing deeply, Gwyndolin continued on through the hallways. He would likely return to his chambers. He paused once again. Turning around, he headed in the opposite direction towards his room and further into Chaldea. If he recalled the tour correctly, then the cafeteria would be through this hallway and then a single floor upwards. He could just teleport there, but it was a rare thing for him to move around for so long. If only because he disliked seeing the way his snake legs behaved, and as if sensing his tumultuous emotions, they peered up at him and tilted their heads. Gwyndolin refused to look at them. They represented a curse to his form and nothing more. The pillar of light flashed as a figure emerged on the panel. Ritzka's welcoming smile remained even as he took note of the familiar purple hair and tall figure. He tilted his head in wonder. He was more worried about whether or not they would remember him. Mash stood to his left, slightly shifty as the figure stepped down from the summoning chamber and towards them, looking down at the smaller boy and smaller girl before her lips pursed. Ritzka felt as though he had an understanding of the type of person they were already. Probably a little quiet and reserved. They had a pretty similar feeling to Gwyndolin in the instances where he had been with them. Although that might also be because he already knew who this was or at the very least suspected. Summoning me means you have a strange preference. The woman spoke in a slightly hushed tone with a hint of surprise to it before it tapered out into a more composed voice. If it is a sacrifice you require, then you may treat me as you wish. Ritzka blinked at her once. All right then. He coughed into his hand, looking at Mash and earning a shrug in response before he turned back to her and looked into the blindfold directly. Something which seemed to catch the taller woman off guard by the fact she could sense he was at the very least attempting to look her in the eye. She chalked that down to him being ignorant as to her identity. She imagined it would change the moment she revealed who she. Sorry if this comes off as a little rude, he spoke in a slightly unsure tone as he stared at her, but you're Medusa, right? I am. She nodded her head, tilting it at him. You already know who I am. Met another version of you, he replied with a casual smile, then winced slightly. She could ascertain that it hadn't been a pleasant meeting. Although that made his attempt to be cordial with her all the more puzzling. Also, you look a bit like your sisters. She took in a sharp intake of breath, her form going stock still. My sis, she then looked around. Are they here? She asked. Ritzka watched her reaction oddly for a few moments before he shook his head. No, not yet. He spoke slowly, watching as she seemed to deflate at the news. But we met them, so the version of you we met was a Lancer. She hummed at that, trying to take her mind off the fact she might meet her sisters again, for which she was very tense about doing. However much she did truly love them, they were overbearing. Right off the bat would have been a rather surprising first encounter for a summoning. I am a rider, she informed the pair, earning a nod of understanding from the duo. All right, Ritzka clapped his hand. So, the two. You summoned another servant. A third voice called out from the far end of the room. Medusa's head snapped towards them as her eyes narrowed from behind her visor. There was already something that smelt odd about that servant. He might have looked alive, but she could already sense something off about him. The way his green eyes stared at her with a slight hint of recognition told her he might also have encountered her before, the relative of basilisks. That was just insulting. Ash-san. Mash hissed at him in shock and surprise. That's rude. Ash's eyes darted to Mash before they looked back at Medusa and narrowed inquisitively. You have an aura of divinity about you. He spoke in a slightly suspicious tone. It's faint but it's present. That's no real surprise. A fourth voice echoed out above them. Everyone's head darted towards the other end of the room. Romani sat in a chair behind the glass, the man waving his hand at them. With Medusa being the youngest of the Gorgon sisters, she would have been a goddess alongside her two sisters before the man trailed off, widening his eyes and looking away. Yeah. He popped his lips, suddenly finding his desk interesting. Before I became a monster. The writer in question spoke in an almost dismissive tone. There is no reason to skirt around the issue. I am a monster. Then turned to Ash. I assume you have also met me in a previous summoning, judging by your recognition. I killed you. Ash offered as a way of an explanation. After you attempted to petrify me. I see. Medusa curtly replied, the room falling into an awkward silence before Ritsuka decided to speak up. So how about that tour? He looked around the room with a forced smile, trying to alleviate some of the tension in the room. Do you want to join us, Ash? There's no need to involve me. Ash raised his hand. I am already aware of the layout of the building. I am planning on returning to my room. In doing what? Nothing. Really? Ritsuka squinted his eyes at him. Nothing. Nothing. Ash shrugged. Unless you have a need for me. Ash-san. Mash stepped forwards. Why don't you stop by the simulator? You can always get some practice in. She offered with a smile. The saber stared at her for a few moments before he slowly nodded his head. That is certainly a possible activity. He nodded his head in thought. I have been healing and would like to see how far I am along. He hummed, very well. I will stop by the simulator. Have fun. Ritsuka waved to him, Ash's brows furrowed in slight confusion. It's training to ensure I do not die. How is it fun? I don't know the answer to that, Ritsuka quietly admitted, looking down at the ground with a pensive frown. Ash gave another noise before he turned away and started to walk down the hallways. Medusa watched him leave before she returned her attention to the two in front of her. How many other servants are present? She found herself asking. She was also tempted to ask how many had also fought her, but the saber didn't seem to hold much of a grudge. However, she couldn't tell much from him at all. A little over a dozen. Ritsuka frowned, then looked to Mash for support. The girl held a thoughtful expression for a moment before she turned to Ritsuka and nodded. 18, senpai. She revealed. Ritsuka gave a small noise of understanding, then looked back at Medusa. 19 if we include Da Vinci. There we are. He smiled. We've got a few. I see. She nodded in response. She could understand why there were so many to begin with. The throne had provided her with at least some detail as to their current situation. One more thing, Ritsuka raised his hand, giving Medusa a subdued look. How much do you know about other worlds? Even with a visor covering her eyes, it didn't take an expert to see that Medusa was thoroughly confused by his words. He could tell they were surprised by his presence here. He didn't even know why he'd come in the first place. He liked avoiding people, so coming to the one place where they all gathered en masse was just asking for trouble on his part. Or asking for him to be bothered by someone who didn't know how to keep their mouth shut. Fortunately for him, it didn't look like the pink-haired one was present in the cafeteria today. That would at least grant him some peace. His head scanned the room, taking note of those within it. The archer in green armor and the witch were speaking together on the same table. The blue-haired demigod was also sat near the side, granting him a view into the kitchen while sat next to The blacksmith. Neither of them had spoken and there was not a need to. Gwyndolin was under no illusions as to what lineage the man belonged to, especially considering his rather prominent features and their strong resemblance to another. It was best to simply avoid it entirely. There were also a few mortals scattered about, although they avoided him entirely, and that was something he was more than pleased with. Although the manner in which some of the sorcerers thought of servants like himself as little more than familiars was something that he found to be rather insulting. He might have spent much of his time alone thus far, but that didn't make him ignorant as to the opinions of the mages here. His head turned down to stare down at his table in front of him. What was he even doing here? Was he here just because he didn't want to return to his room? He exhaled slowly. He didn't even know why he was here to begin with. What did the life of humans matter to him? This was not even his world, and these humans were not even under the blessing of Gwyn. He knew, of course, deep down why he was actually in Chaldea. Not because he cared about people or because their pleas mattered to him in the least. Not even because of his previous role as Knight Captain of the Darkmoons. He just wanted someone to. He abruptly jolted upright, frowning and looking over the edge of his table down towards his legs. His deformity had started to protrude out from underneath his gown. The individual heads were slowly slithering forwards and rising up. He frowned down at them. Usually they did not act so brazenly when he did not wish it. He could exert his will over them often enough, but they still held some semblance of intellect to them. What concerned him was why they were all staring in the same direction. He shifted his head to follow their eyes, finding himself staring at the door to the cafeteria. It was still closed, but he could sense a servant approaching. There was something about them that felt odd to him. Some familiarity perhaps, but they did not feel like a full-blown god. Perhaps one of the lesser lordkin. He usually just walks around. Ritska explained to Medusa as they continued their tour through Chaldea, his expression still in a casual smile as he looked back. Although I didn't know that Fu had taken to riding his back, he mused with a shake of his head and a curious expression directed towards Mash. The girl frowned in response before tilting her head in a thoughtful manner. Perhaps it is because they are both animals. She offered a way of an explanation. Ritska blinked twice before he let out a small noise of understanding. Huh. That might make sense. He murmured, do you think Fu was feeling lonely so that's why he's friends with Sif? I hope so. Mash smiled. I think it's very sweet, senpai. I think Fu-san could do with a friend who can actually understand him. Medusa frowned at the thought. Can they understand each other? She asked out loud, looking at the duo. I honestly have no idea, but I think it's best we just assume they can. Ritska shrugged. I do wonder what they might talk about though. They'd be too cold. I suppose that explains the strange smell I got from her. Sif rumbled in response, pacing through the hall with Fu sitting on his back. The entire image was nothing shy of comical, and yet the conversation between the two furred animals was ironically heated. Unlike the individual they were discussing. But don't snakes heat up from their surroundings? I don't know, probably. Fu grunted, but until they did, you'd have cold hands running through your fur. It would be very nice on a hot day, but, well. We don't get hot days out here. Sif sighed. This place reminds me of my home. Well, the outside does before Artorias found me. Cold and lifeless. Yes. Sif admitted with a sigh. Greetwolves come from the cold north, but we get pretty big when full grown. Must be nice. Fu hummed. Then again, you no longer get puppy privileges, do you? Very amusing. Sif drawled. Aside from that, what do you think resting on her legs would be like? Oh, tough question. Fu let out a small noise of thought. If we're still assuming that snakes need to heat up, I'd recommend going to her late in the day when she's had a chance to warm up. But once she did, I'd say it would be very nice. Most assuredly. Sif nodded his head in agreement, but what if she had awful technique? That sounds like something too terrible to comprehend. Fu shivered. I think our original owners have influenced us too much. Most definitely. What about resting on her breasts? I wouldn't even care if they're cold. Arguably that makes them better. I personally don't like sleeping on warm pillows. Me neither. Sif shook his head. You have to find one that's just a little chilled and then wait for it to warm up. Exactly. Probably something amusing, senpai. Mash giggled, then looked back up at Medusa. Anyway. She changed the subject. Our next stop is the cafeteria. It's where all the servants typically go for food. Medusa frowned. Food. We can sustain ourselves with magical energy. There is no need for us to participate in the consumption of food. Ritsuka shrugged. We've got a big cafeteria and it would probably feel way too empty if barely anyone ate there, so we just invited the servants to dine with us if they wanted to. He smiled at her. You don't have to, but sometimes they also use it for socializing. He explained further, in case you want to talk with anyone. Medusa stared at him in silence. I do not think that will be an issue for me, she replied in a quiet tone which indicated that socialisung probably wasn't going to be on her list of activities. Ust mad that I beat you. She paused as she heard a rather feminine voice which echoed through the halls. Look, if it bothers you that much. It is not a question of whether it bothers me. A deeper reverberating voice followed after it. Medusa tilted her head. There was something off about the voice, although it was probably nothing important. I lost the match, so therefore I will eat without my helmet on. Verndari, the voice spoke in a slightly guilty tone, you don't have to. It would be against my vows if I were to back out of an agreement between knights. The duo rounded the corner, revealing the two other servants. A larger individual clad in shiny steel armor with a three-faced helmet and a crown of thorns, and a smaller blonde-haired girl in a brown tunic and a dark green undershirt with black sleeves. The larger knight pointed down at the girl. Listen, you bested me fair and square, and as per our agreement, I will. They paused. Eat without my helmet. The small girl fidgeted on the spot before her eyes lit up, staring up at the taller knight and giving a faint smile. What about best 2 out of 3? I feel as though we can't decide on something as important as this in a single match, she hummed, or 3 out of 5. The larger knight stared down at them for a few moments before their posture visibly relaxed. Best 3 out of 5, they gave a pleased chuckle. I suppose that is certainly agreeable, and it is your right as victor. Hem. The girl crossed her arms and beamed, then turned ahead only to find themselves under the watchful eyes of 3 individuals. Ah, master. Mash, and her eyes fell onto Medusa, a new person. My liege. Medusa blinked at the rather reverent tone the knight took on, sending another look at Ritsuka and finding them looking slightly bothered by it but more resigned. Squire Kyrilight. She turned back to see the knight staring down at her. Is this our newest arrival? Yes. Ritsuka clapped his hands, pointing towards the two. This is Sir Venardari. He pointed at the taller knight, who bowed his head slightly, and this is Sir Gareth. Milady. Gareth gave a similar bow, then blinked as Medusa seemed to focus on them with a slight intensity. Is something wrong? History, or so it seems. Ah, he. Gareth gave a small giggle. That'll be those records of me being a man. She waved her hand. It's happened all the time. I only recently found out my king was actually a woman, she exclaimed, placing her hands on her hips. Then only just the other day, Vernda. Ahem. Verndari cleared his throat loudly, halting Gareth in her tracks. Nothing. She corrected herself. Anyway, so who are you? Medusa. Gareth maintained her smiling visage for a few more moments before she blinked. Twice. Medusa, she said in a slow tone. Yes. Right. The knight frowned and nodded her head before she looked back at the rider. Well. If you're here to help, then I look forward to working with you," she exclaimed. The Silver Knight was still staring at her. Vrindari stared at her for a few more moments, then looked at Ritska. Is this the same Medusa who was regarded as a petrifying monster? I am. Medusa nodded her head. Is there perhaps an issue? He stared at her for a few moments longer, then looked down at Ritska. The boy shook his head at the knight, earning a low breath. It seems there is not. He spoke in a quiet tone. So long as you keep your master alive and fulfill his orders, we shall have no issues, he offered. That was more in line with the response she was expecting. Gareth Winston lightly slapped Vrindari in the side before nodding further down the hallway. Well, it was nice meeting you. We've got to get to the simulator now. Ash San is currently using it. Mash explained, although I don't think he would say no to others. All right then. Gareth nodded, then pointed down the hallway, to the simulator. She cried out before marching down the hall with a certain vigor, propelling her forwards. Vrindari stared at Medusa for a few moments longer in silence before he turned away and marched after Gareth. Where did Vrindari hear about Medusa anyway? Ritska whispered to Mash. The shielder leaned back to reply. Da Vinci said that some of the other servants reported getting updated on the legends from each world. She thinks that having the otherworldly Grail here sped up the process of updating the information on the throne to account for the other world. She shrugged. It's been slow and some areas are still missing, but they understand some of it now. She frowned, although getting information on Ash San's legend still brings up a blank. Ritska hummed in response, then shrugged and turned back to Medusa. Sorry about that. He apologized. Some of the other servants are still a little iffy on the. You need not apologize for his behavior. She interrupted him before he could continue. It is not that great a bother to me. Still, Ritska gave a saddened frown. Well, if it doesn't bother you, that's fine, but don't hesitate to speak up if they take it too far. He sighed. We've had enough of that around here as of late. He muttered under his breath. Medusa sent him a curious expression behind her visor before they continued on their way towards the cafeteria. The moment the door opened, she could sense something was different. She was being watched, and there was the familiar scent and feel of divinity. Not like that of a demigod, this was pure. Her head instantly snapped towards the source. Even without the use of her eyes, she could feel them staring at her, and she stared back. The two engaged in an almost blind contest as their headgear obscured both sets of eyes from the other person. That didn't take away from the silent staring contest between the two. Medusa wasn't actually hearing whatever Ritska was speaking of at the time as she stared at the being across the room. Then took note of the dozen snakes which had emerged from beneath their dress. She tilted her head and narrowed her eyes behind her visor. They were a goddess, but she didn't recognize anything about them, save for the snakes, but that didn't make her any less suspicious about them. She did not have something which could be considered a positive relationship with divines, save her sisters, and Athena could be thanked for that. Whoever this new goddess was, she was already dubious about them already. USA San. She started, looking to her side and noticing the two staring up at her in concern. Is something wrong? Mash asked, then turned her head towards the direction she had been looking at before her eyes widened. Gwendolyn San is here. He's what? Ritska blinked in surprise. He then turned towards the god in question. Didn't think he'd be here. He's also looking at us. Medusa picked up on one specific part of the sentence, he. She spoke with a puzzled tone, staring at the two and then back at the god. Her lips thinned. That would explain why he was now looking at her. She was aware of the effect she had on divine spirits in this form. It was close enough to how she was when she caught Poseidon's attention. You have divine spirits here? She asked out in curiosity. Ritska nodded his head. It's just him right now, unless you also count. He frowned. Then there's Havel to consider. He's not human either, is he? No, senpai. Mash shook her head. He is part of the Lordkin, I believe. So he would fall into the category of divine spirit, she explained, earning a small nod from both Ritsuka and Medusa. The latter raised her head to look back at Gwyndolin, who was still staring at her with all of his snake heads, before her lips thinned. Why is he staring at me? Gwyndolin. Ritsuka shrugged. He also spoke with your sisters, he revealed with an awkward chuckle. Medusa stared down at him with her lips slightly parted. He spoke with my sisters? She asked with a quiet voice, then looked back towards him. Does he know who I don't know. Ritsuka shrugged. Wanna go and speak with him? No. She shook her head. That will not be necessary, you had other places too. So kid, I heard about the. She looked towards the voice. Cu Chilane stared back at her with a blank expression. Then she watched as another head peered at her from the window to the kitchen. The familiar face of Archer stared at her with an equally blank look before it gradually retreated back into the kitchen. So, Cu whistled. You're here. So are you. Cool. Cu coughed, then looked at Ritsuka before looking back at Medusa before he cracked a faint grin. So kid, what do you think? Ritsuka blinked at him. What do I think? About her. He pointed at Medusa. Suppose you understand how she turned hundreds of men hard. His lip quirked into a smile as he struggled to not laugh. Medusa gave him a thoroughly unimpressed look while Ritsuka burst into a coughing fit induced by strangled laughter. Mash blushed furiously and tried to decide between chastising Cu for his crude humor or asking someone why that particular comment made her feel horribly embarrassed. He stared at her from across the room. She was engaged in conversation with the others, but he couldn't shake the sense of familiarity she had with others he had previously spoken with. That shade of purple hair and the tingling of divinity meant she was at least affiliated with the lords, however it was faint. It was odd. If her divine presence was stronger, he would have thought she was related to Steno and Euryale. There was also the manner in which his legs were staring at her as if they were encapsulated by her form. It was strange. Perhaps a distant relative, however he recalled what Euryale said of her sister. Although he still failed to understand how that could be classed as a deformity. It was hardly in line with his own features. He supposed he could just inquire her about it. It also occurred to him he had been staring for an uncomfortable length of time. His head swiftly darted back to the table, his hand clasping together and resting on the table. For a few moments he remained silent, hoping that he had avoided being intrusive. Medusa wondered if the god was aware that his snakes were still staring at her. There was something oddly poetic about her attracting the attention of snakes. She was more curious as to what led to a god growing snakes for legs. Perhaps they had also been cursed as well. Although they had apparently spoken with her sisters. She pursed her lips before looking down at Ritsuka. What relation did he have with my sisters? Well, he and Steno were stranded on an island. Ritsuka replied, crossing his arms and humming. I think they were on good terms, considering he seemed to rush at the opportunity to speak with Euryale, who they spoke with at length. He winced. He also knows Artemis, although he's a little embarrassed by her. Medusa tilted her head. Why? Well, that's sort of because she lacks in her duties as a goddess. Ritsuka jolted at the sudden proximity of Gwyndolin's voice. He and Medusa. She's also. He trailed off, staring down at nothing for a few moments before his head slowly turned towards Medusa. Medusa stared back at him. She hadn't been so close to another divine spirit for some time and hadn't really had much of an interest in one aside from her sisters. Thou art. Gwyndolin's delicate lips struggled to form the words as his covered head turned to Medusa and stared up at her. Thou art the younger sister of Ladies Euryale and Steno, art thee not? Medusa silently nodded her head. Gwendolin slowly nodded his head. I see. He hummed in response. Thy sisters spoke of thee. He informed her, then turned away and moved for the door. I desire thou art reunited with thy sisters. He paused as he observed her reaction for a few moments before he spoke up again. I understand they art also strongly opinionated. Lady Steno did enjoy making jokes at mine own expense. Medusa slowly nodded her head. They are, she trailed off, closing her mouth and very much unwilling to discuss the topic further. Who knows if they would hear about it if they were summoned. My sisters. She decided to finish. Gwyndolin stared at her for a few moments. Yes, they are, he quietly replied, turning away from her and moving out of the room only to stop when Da Vinci suddenly burst in. Hey Gwyndolin, she hurriedly greeted as she marched past him. Sorry, I'm late Fujimaru. She apologized. I'm ready to sit in on the summon. She cut herself off when she noticed Medusa standing next to the duo. Her expression slowly shifted into a slight pout. I missed it. Yeah, Riduska winced. Romani said you were busy in your workshop and I didn't want to interrupt you. No, that's fine. She smiled. We'll just head back and do another one. Ritska blinked. We will. Yep. Da Vinci beamed. I'm certain my being there will attract the attention of another caster we can work with. She sent an apologetic smile to Medusa. No offense, miss. Medusa. Ah. Another of the Gorgon trio. Da Vinci exclaimed loudly. I suppose you've met them all now, Fujimaru. Nice to meet you by the way. The genius struck a pose and flicked her hair behind herself. I'm Leonardo da Vinci, all-round genius and grand beauty of Chaldea. Medusa stared at her in complete silence, unsure of how to respond to the rather explosive introduction. She felt a tap on her arm and turned to see Riduska staring up at her with a sympathetic expression. If it makes you feel better, I don't think I've gotten used to it either. He spoke in a tone which the writer supposed was meant to be reassuring, but it wasn't all that comforting. He shifted his attention back to the caster. Anyway, the director told me to take it easy and limit myself to a single summoning, so. Up. Da Vinci waved her hand. Why do limits exist if not to be broken? She gave a self-confident smile. Now hurry up to the summoning chamber. But the tour. Gwyndolin can do it. Da Vinci waved her hand, turning to the moon god. Can't you? The god in question jolted at suddenly being volunteered. I beg thy. Come on, Fujimaru. Da Vinci turned away and marched towards the door. I want to meet another otherworldly heroic spirit. Also we're lacking in women around here. Again no offense Medusa. The woman's voice quietened down as she marched through the halls with purpose. Ritska looked wide-eyed between Medusa, both of whom stared at each other and then back at him. Gee, good luck. Hurry up. Da Vinci's voice echoed out through the hallway. I've got a good feeling about this one. There aren't too many spots left. Ritska explained to Gwyndolin. Do you have a problem with showing her around the remainder of Chaldea? Gwyndolin stared at him in silence before he replied. I have no issues. He spoke slowly, looking up at Medusa. Is there an issue? No. Medusa replied after a few moments. All right, great. Ritska clapped his hands, then nodded to Mash. Come on. We'll follow after her before she tries to summon anyone herself. Mash nodded her head and then followed after him as he quickly chased the caster servant moving through the halls. Gwyndolin and Medusa watched them leave before the pair slowly turned back to face each other. The two masked people stared at each other in silence before Gwyndolin spoke up. Have they brought you the library yet? No. Medusa shook her head, then stared at the god with a hint of curiosity. What happened to your voice? Gwyndolin's lips thinned. It is something I use for the mortals. Oh, so I am an honored exception then. She mused with a slightly curled lip. The god's lip twitched. Would you like for me to put the voice on again? He asked with a hint of amusement. Medusa shrugged. You can do as you wish. She paused for a few moments. How were my sisters? They were pleasant enough company. he replied, despite her comments upon my disfigurement. Gwyndolin's head pointedly looked down at his snake legs before it returned to stare up at Medusa. She was welcome company. Medusa stared at him. Really? Of a sort. He shrugged. Have you seen the library? A library? Medusa hummed. That sounded mildly intriguing to her. Usually such places were quiet and out of the way. Something which she felt would apply to her. I have not. Where is it? Gwendolyn gestured behind him. Come, I will show you. He felt mildly good about this. There was something about Medusa that seemed more reserved than her sisters. The outgoing personalities of Steno and Euryale had virtually dragged him into conversation. Not that it bothered him too greatly, but he just wasn't accustomed to conversation with those outside of his own family. Except for Sullivan, but the ending for that was. The pair quietly left the room. One personal issue Gwendolyn had was that his snake legs were still staring at her. Medusa herself wasn't sure how to respond to snake heads staring up at her with what could only be described as puppy dog eyes. It also brought about a certain degree of shame for her past, but that was something she'd rather not recall. Come on, Da Vinci whined. Hurry up, Fujimaru, I've got a holy grail I need to experiment on. Ritsuka gave her a puzzled look for a few seconds. Is that the grail we got from the last singularity? Yep. Da Vinci nodded her head. Turns out it used to belong to the chief god of the otherworld pantheon. So it's actually very, very powerful. She gave a thumbs up. I have no end of ideas. Huh, Ritsuka blinked, then gave her a reassuring smile. Good luck. Ha 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 ha. Throwing her head back and releasing a boisterous laugh, Da Vinci remained like that for a few moments before she stared at the master. Geniuses don't need luck because it implies that our skill won't see us through, but I am very thankful for your words anyway. All right then. Ritsuka stared at Mash and gave her a small shrug before he moved to the summoning panel. Hey, are we doing another summoning? Romani's voice came through the monitor, the man swinging his chair around to sit himself down in it before sliding forwards towards the desk. I thought we already did this. We did. Ritsuka called back, but Da Vinci was sad she missed it and wanted to be involved. So she dragged you back. Romani sighed. The director did ask that you limit yourself. Wait a minute, did she give you the whole "limits are made to be broken" speech? Yeah, has she done that before? Normally whenever she brings up a project which tests the limits of what we actually allow for the research and development department. The man sighed. I suppose we'll have to make a report to the director about it anyway. Your tests are already looking good, so I suppose if you want we can try a summoning. All right then. Ritsuka shrugged, moving to the panel and started chanting. Once he had finished, the panel activated, shooting a pillar of light upwards into the ceiling before it slowly dissipated. A figure stood in the chamber, standing around the same height as Da Vinci. Ritsuka stared at the dark blue robe and the stone mask on their face carved in the face of a bearded man. The issue was also that the figure was dripping wet, water continuously leaking from the eye holes of the mask like tears and somehow moving to drench the entire person. It was somewhat puzzling. The head stared at Ritsuka and then to Mash before finally Da Vinci. Servant, caster. The voice spoke in a deeply muffled tone which made it difficult to discern gender. I am. Wow. They jolted in surprise. It is really difficult to understand me in this thing, isn't it? They released an amused chuckle before they reached up and clasped their mask and slowly removed it from their head before revealing it. Shaking their hair free, they slot the mask under their left arm. Their right arm moved up and swept their hair out of their face, unveiling it in full. Soft features and a strangely familiar smile greeted him. Their light brown fluffy hair fell behind their head and down their neck as they stared at the three in front of them. I suppose I should introduce myself again. The woman grinned an eerily familiar smile. I am Pharaoh's, traveling vagabond and all-around master inventor. She paused for a few moments then beamed. Ah, I suppose you could call me a universal genius. Oh, Romani muttered through the microphone. Ritska and Mash slowly turned their heads towards Da Vinci. The woman stood stock still with a blank expression on her face as she stared at the caster in front of her. Pharaohs turned and stared at the genius with a slightly raised eyebrow. Huh. You, she pointed at Da Vinci. I don't know, I like you. She decided with a nod, there's just something about you. Da Vinci remained silent before her face spread into a matching smile before her eyes fell on the mask. So, what does that do? This. Pharaohs raised the mask. It coats me in water and renders me immune to fire. She explained, it does get me a little wet and you know, electricity is a problem but the water does also stop me getting poisoned so that's alright too. Huh. Da Vinci hummed, very nice, a few kinks but I think they could be worked out very well. You know, I'm something of an inventor myself. Really? Pharaohs gave a cat-like smirk. How do you feel about competitions? Da Vinci's eyes seemed to glow. Ooh. She gave a very pleased noise. I suppose that would depend upon my competitor. She is very interested in competitions. Pharaohs chuckled, rocking on her heels before leaning forwards. When would you be interested in starting? Oh, Da Vinci pretended to look at her watch. How about, right now? Right now is fine. Ritska stared at Mash and then looked at Romani through the window. The man was leaning back in his chair with wide eyes as he stared at what was occurring in front of him. Oh no, there's two of them, he whispered out in shock. It was a shock Ritska could share. She didn't look like Da Vinci, but she certainly seemed to act a bit like her. He only hoped this competition wouldn't get out of hand. Pharaohs, the vagabond, servant, caster. Strength, D. Endurance, D. Agility, D. Mana, B+. Luck, A. Noble phantasm, X. Inventor of everything and more, X. Anti-unit max target, 1. Max range. Their skill which accredits them with deeds not their own. Pharaohs was indeed a talented inventor, perhaps too good for their own good. Especially effective against inventors. It is a NP which allows her to understand complex creations and constructs and understand their weaknesses and strengths. Perhaps even the ability to create versions with her own personal twist. Class skills. Item construction. XA. Their talent was so great that many inventions are falsely credited to them. It takes nothing away from their achievement, however. They can craft a great manner of contraptions. All of which are more bizarre than the last. Territory creation, D. They were a vagabond, therefore their skill is low. Personal skills. Inherent wisdom, A+. Lockstone construction, A. The creation of traps and constructs which aided many in the lands. Ideas from others, B++. Because their renown was so great, they were falsely credited with the creation of items they did not construct. However, the knowledge of these ideas remains. In conjunction with their NP, it is a powerful skill. She is actually quite guilty about having this skill, but she's determined to make the ideas her own. Summoning. I'm a caster class servant. The all-around genius vagabond inventor Pharaohs. If you need amazing gizmos, I'm your gal, EH. You already have a genius inventor. Oh, well, you can never have enough genius. Dialogue 1. They say a lot of stuff like master and servant and all that. On that note, would you like to help me with my latest invention? I think it has some very promising results. No. Oh, well, what about next time? Dialogue 2. Huh. Why was I known as a man? It was the mask. I normally wore that all the time and that stuffy cloak was really unflattering for my body, so, you know. They just thought I was a man and I just didn't make an effort to correct them. Pretty awkward now though, right? Dialogue 3. So, do you want to help now? No, phooey. Dialogue 4. If you have Da Vinci. She's another genius EH. Well, I'm always one for competitions though. Do you want to help us with another? Hey. Where are you going? Come back. Dialogue 5. If you have bearer of the curse. Huh, she's actually pretty good at making stuff. I guess a little collaboration would be in order, but she's got this weirdly cool but pretty face. Like she sees right through you half the time. Dialogue 6. If you have Merlin. Nope. Not at all. Way too laid back. How does he just make stuff so good and be like that? It kind of bugs me. I'm gonna help Da Vinci booby trap his room. Dialogue 7. If you have Thomas Edison. Hey, what's this, King of Inventions, title I'm hearing just now? I call foul. Foul I say. I'm way better than that guy. Da Vinci's also better than that guy. Dialogue 8. If you Nikola Tesla. That's an impressive ability, you can control lightning niece. Would you like to help with some inventions No, I'm not going to steal your ideas. I have loads of people giving me credit for stuff I didn't even do and I can't stand it. Anyway, want to help make an invention. Well, I guess it could be used to throw vegetables, but why do you want to? Dialogue 9. Avisbron. His golems are very good but I feel as though I could improve them a little. Or make my own. I wonder if he'd be okay with that. I'll ask him. Likes. I love inventing things. Do you want to help invent things? I'll even show you how to do some stuff. Hates. Well, I'm not a fan of my noble phantasm if I'm honest. I spent years honing my skills and to just be able to copy someone else's at a glance just feels wrong. I'll do it if you really want me to, but I'm not all that comfortable with it. Wish for the Holy Grail. A wish, I wouldn't mind having one. Change my noble phantasm so that people know what I invented and what I didn't. Bond level 1. You're a little funny. Like a small goofy kid. I like you. Bond level 2. I've been thinking of some invention, would you like to help me with it? Don't worry, it's not that weird or dangerous. Bond level 3. So I've been talking with Da Vinci about this latest invention. Hey, where are you going? Come back. Bond level 4. So, I like helping out and this place offers a lot of opportunities. So thanks for the summoning. I really do appreciate the chance you've given me. Bond level 5. This has been a fun journey so far and I'm excited to continue on whatever happens. I might not be a great inventor like Da Vinci or that weird lion-headed guy, but I'll always be there for weird handy gizmos if you need them. That is a pharaoh's patented promise. Birthday. A birthday. You should have told me earlier. I'll have to rush to make you a birthday present. Wait right there and don't move a muscle. During an event. I'm sensing an opportunity, let's go have some fun. First ascension. Phew. Imagine wearing that stuff mask for much longer. Way easier to breathe without it. Also it gets really old if I'm wet all the time and there's no fire around me. Second ascension. Can I get some better robes? Is that a thing we do around here? Because I feel a little boring just wearing a plain old robe. Third ascension. Still no new clothes. Phooey. I'm a little jealous of Da Vinci. You know she makes her own outfits. Hey, do you think Vlad or Medea can make one for me? Fourth ascension. This is much better. It really brings out my figure too. Hey, don't look away now. Look at me. Look.